I never thought it would come to this, betrayed by the man who promised forever. My heart screamed, how could he? Revenge lingered in my mind, but could I ruin everything? I stood on my neighbor's doorstep, my hand trembling as it hovered over the doorbell. My heart pounded like a drum in my chest, drowning out the world around me. The cool evening air brushed against my skin, a cruel reminder that I was about to cross a line I couldn't uncross. How did I end up here? A wife married for 10 years, standing on another man's porch, hoping, no, needing, something I couldn't get at home. I told myself I just wanted to talk, that his warm smile and kind words were innocent, but deep down, I knew this wasn't about conversation anymore. It had started months ago, a series of seemingly small, insignificant moments. My husband stopped noticing me. The dinners I cooked, the effort I put into myself, all of it became invisible to him. His career consumed him, leaving me to eat alone most nights, to sleep in a bed that felt colder than the empty side he rarely occupied. Then there was him, the neighbor, a man who always had time for me, who noticed the little things my husband didn't, one lingering glance, one gentle laugh, and now I was here, my finger brushing the doorbell. What would happen if he opened the door? Would I find the connection I'd been aching for? Or was I about to destroy everything I thought I still wanted? Before we dive into this story, please subscribe to my channel to hear more gripping tales like this one. And let me know in the comments, what would you do if your heart led you somewhere forbidden? Let me know if this works for you or if you'd like any changes. He said, set 1500. ChatGPT said, here's the 1500-word setup for your story. My husband ignored me for months, so I turned to our neighbor. When I married Jason 10 years ago, I thought I'd found my forever. He was everything I wanted, driven, confident, and ambitious. He had big dreams, and I loved that about him. But somewhere along the way, those dreams consumed him and left me behind. Our mornings used to start with whispered I love yous and coffee on the patio. Now, Jason leaves the house before I even wake up, his tie already askew as he types furiously on his phone. Evenings, once filled with long conversations and laughter, have turned into him retreating into his office, laptop glowing, as I sit alone in the dimly lit living room. I tried to fill the silence, joining yoga classes, volunteering at the community center, but nothing seemed to soothe the ache. My life became a routine of loneliness, my only company, the clock ticking on the wall and the occasional text from Jason. Running late, don't wait up. Then there was the neighbor, Matthew, a man I'd only exchanged pleasantries with over the years, waving to him while gardening or borrowing sugar when I ran out. Matthew lived alone. His wife had passed away a few years ago, and while he kept a polite smile on his face, I'd always sensed a sadness lingering in his eyes. It was a late spring afternoon when I truly noticed him for the first time. I'd just finished watering my plants when he leaned over the fence, his warm smile breaking through my gloom. These roses are beautiful this year, he said, his deep voice like a balm to my frazzled nerves. I smiled back, brushing a strand of hair from my face. Thank you. They've been stubborn, but I finally got them to cooperate. He chuckled, leaning on the fence as if he had all the time in the world. I've always admired how much care you put into your garden. I wish I had your patience. It wasn't a flirtatious comment, just kind, but in that moment it was more attention than Jason had given me in weeks. From there, our interactions grew. We'd chat briefly when we crossed paths, about the weather, about his dog, about the new restaurant that had just opened downtown. It was innocent, or so I told myself. I wasn't looking for anything. I just needed someone to notice me, to acknowledge that I still existed. One day, Jason came home late again, his briefcase in one hand and his phone glued to his ear. I watched him from the kitchen as he muttered something about deadlines and investors. He barely looked up when I set dinner on the table. "Not hungry," he said, waving me off as he disappeared into his office. I stared at the untouched meal, my appetite fading into the same void that had swallowed our marriage. That night, as I lay alone in bed, I realized I couldn't remember the last time Jason had kissed me, really kissed me. I couldn't recall the last time he'd asked me how I was feeling or what I wanted. The next morning, I found myself lingering at the garden fence, hoping to catch Matthew on his way to work. Sure enough, he appeared, his golden retriever trotting happily at his side. "Good morning," I said, my voice a little too eager. "Good morning," he replied, slowing his pace as his dog sniffed at my flower beds. "How's everything going?" It was a simple question, but it opened a floodgate. I told him about my frustrations with Jason, not the deep, raw emotions, but enough to hint at my loneliness. Matthew listened, nodding thoughtfully. He didn't offer advice or judgment, just understanding, and it felt like a lifeline. Days turned into weeks, and our conversations grew longer. He started coming over for coffee, sitting on the patio with me as the sun dipped below the horizon. He'd bring small gifts, a book he thought I'd like, fresh herbs from his garden, a candle that smelled like lavender. Jason didn't notice, of course. Even on the rare evenings he was home, he was glued to his laptop, oblivious to the world around him. One afternoon, after Jason had left for yet another weekend business trip, Matthew knocked on my door. He held a small bouquet of wildflowers, their vibrant colors brightening the grayness of my mood. "I thought these might cheer you up," he said, his smile as warm as the sun. "Thank you," I murmured, taking the flowers and inhaling their sweet scent. "Come in. I just made some tea." We sat in the living room, the scent of chamomile filling the air. We talked about everything and nothing. Our favorite childhood memories, the places we'd always dreamed of visiting. I found myself laughing, really laughing, for the first time in months. "You have a beautiful laugh," he said softly, his eyes locking with mine. A blush crept up my cheeks, and I looked away, suddenly self-conscious. But his words stayed with me, replaying in my mind long after he'd gone home. As the days passed, I found myself looking forward to our time together. I'd linger at the fence or accidentally bump into him while walking to the mailbox. Each interaction felt like a balm to my aching heart. But with each passing day, the line between friendship and something more began to blur. I noticed the way his eyes lingered on me a little longer, the way his hand would brush against mine as he handed me a cup of tea, and I didn't pull away. One evening, as we sat on the patio watching the stars, he turned to me, his expression serious. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his voice low. "Of course," I replied, my heart beating faster. "Are you happy?" The question caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came out. Was I happy? The answer was obvious, but admitting it felt like a betrayal. "I don't know," I finally whispered, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. Matthew reached out, his hand covering mine. "You deserve to be," he said softly. In that moment, something shifted. The air between us grew heavier, charged with unspoken emotions. I looked into his eyes, searching for answers, but all I saw was the same longing I felt. For the first time in years, I felt seen, heard, desired, and it terrified me. This setup builds the foundation for the story's emotional conflict and sets the stage for the escalation to come. Let me know if you'd like any adjustments or if I should continue to the next segment. He said, "Climax 1,500 words." ChatGPT said, "Here's the 1,500 word climax for your story. My husband ignored me for months, so I turned to our neighbor for. The evening was cool, the kind of night that invited deep breaths and long conversations under the stars. I had started walking my dog later than usual, hoping it would clear my mind, but deep down, I knew I was hoping for something else entirely. Another coincidental encounter with Matthew. Sure enough, as I rounded the corner near his house, there he was. He was sitting on his porch, a book in hand and a cup of tea resting on the small table beside him. The sight of him brought an immediate smile to my face, and before I could even think, I found myself walking toward him. "You're out late," he said, setting the book aside as I approached. "Couldn't sleep," I admitted, keeping my tone casual even as my heart raced. "Thought a walk might help. Join me?" He gestured to the empty chair beside him, and without hesitation, I accepted. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the sounds of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves filling the air. He poured me a cup of tea, the warmth of it soothing in my hands. But it wasn't just the tea that was comforting. It was the presence of someone who seemed to genuinely care. "I've been thinking about what you said the other day," he began, his voice soft yet steady. "About not knowing if you're happy." My throat tightened. I don't know what to say to that, Matthew." "You don't have to say anything," he replied, turning to face me fully. "I just want you to know. You deserve more than feeling invisible." The sincerity in his voice was overwhelming, and for a moment, I couldn't meet his gaze. But when I did, the intensity in his eyes caught me off guard. It was as if he could see through every wall I'd built, every lie I'd told myself to make my life seem okay. "Matthew," I started, but he shook his head. "I'm not trying to make things harder for you," he said quickly. Being around you, it's made me realize how much I've missed having someone to talk to laugh with. And I think you've missed that too." I couldn't deny it. He was right. I had missed all of those things, more than I'd ever admitted, even to myself. But hearing him say it out loud brought a mix of emotions I wasn't prepared to handle. Before I could respond, he reached out and gently took my hand in his. The warmth of his touch sent a jolt through me, and I felt my resolve weakening. "Tell me to stop, and I will," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But if you feel even a fraction of what I feel," his words hung in the air, heavy with possibility. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Every rational thought told me to pull away, to go home and pretend this moment never happened. But the ache in my chest, the one that had been there for so long, was louder than reason. "I don't know what I'm doing," I admitted, my voice trembling. "But I know I can't keep feeling this way." He didn't say anything, just closed the distance between us. His lips met mine in a kiss that was soft yet electric, filling the void that had been gnawing at me for months. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt wanted, alive. When we finally pulled apart, the reality of what had just happened hit me like a wave. I stared at him, my breath shaky as guilt and exhilaration warred within me. "I should go," I said, standing abruptly. "Wait," he said, his voice laced with urgency. "Don't run away from this, from us." "Us?" I repeated, my heart sinking. "Matthew, I don't even know what this is. I stopped, unable to find the words to explain the whirlwind of emotions coursing through me. "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give," he said, standing as well. "But you need to ask yourself what you want, not what your husband wants, or what anyone else thinks you should do. What do you want?" His words stayed with me as I walked home, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I opened the door to my house, it was eerily quiet. Jason was still in his office, the faint glow of his laptop visible through the slightly ajar door. For a moment, I considered walking in and telling him everything, laying it all out and forcing him to see me, to really see me. But instead, I went to bed, the weight of the night pressing down on me like a lead blanket. The following days were a blur of conflicted emotions. I avoided Matthew, afraid of what I might do if I saw him again. But the distance only seemed to amplify my feelings, and every time Jason brushed past me without so much as a glance, I felt the pull toward Matthew grow stronger. One evening, Jason finally noticed something was off, or perhaps he'd known all along and just didn't want to confront it. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his tone more curious than concerned. "Everything okay?" I hesitated, torn between honesty and the easier route of brushing it off. "I'm fine," I said finally, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. He nodded, already turning back to his work. And just like that, the moment passed, leaving me feeling even more invisible than before. It was a week later when everything came to a head. I was sitting on the patio, staring at the garden that had once brought me so much joy, but now felt like a hollow reminder of the life I'd built. I didn't hear Matthew approach until he was standing at the gate, his expression a mixture of hope and apprehension. "Can we talk?" he asked. I nodded, unable to find my voice. He stepped inside, his presence filling the empty space around me. "I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted, his voice raw with emotion. "But I need to know where you stand. I can't keep doing this if you're not sure." I looked at him, my heart aching at the vulnerability in his eyes. "I don't know what I'm sure of," I said honestly. "All I know is that being around you feels right. And yet it feels so wrong at the same time." He nodded as if he understood. "I don't want to complicate your life, but I also can't pretend I don't feel this way about you." The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel the weight of his words, the unspoken ultimatum they carried. And for the first time, I realized I couldn't keep straddling the line between two lives. "I need time," I said finally, my voice breaking. "I need to figure out what I want." Matthew's expression softened, but there was a flicker of sadness in his eyes. "Take all the time you need," he said, "but just know I'll be here." As he walked away, I felt a pang of loss, even though I knew he wasn't gone for good. The choices before me were clearer than ever, but the path forward felt more uncertain. The day the truth began to unravel started like any other. Jason left for work early, his tie slightly crooked and his laptop bag slung over his shoulder. He kissed my cheek on autopilot, his lips barely brushing my skin before he mumbled, "See you tonight." But tonight would be anything but normal. I spent most of the morning pacing around the house, replaying Matthew's words from the week before. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here." His sincerity haunted me, his patience a stark contrast to Jason's growing indifference. I thought I had time to figure things out, to decide what I wanted without the pressure of immediate consequences. But life rarely works that way. It was late in the afternoon when Jason came home unexpectedly. I was folding laundry in the living room, startled by the sound of the front door slamming shut. He wasn't supposed to be home for hours. "Jason?" I called out, peering down the hallway. He didn't respond at first. Instead, I heard the heavy thud of his briefcase hitting the floor and the shuffle of his shoes being kicked off. When he finally stepped into the living room, his expression was unreadable, a mixture of frustration and something else I couldn't quite place. "Why didn't you answer your phone?" he asked, his voice clipped. "I didn't hear it," I said, gesturing to my phone on the coffee table. "Is everything okay?" Jason ran a hand through his hair, his movements tense. "I got a text today," he began, his eyes locking onto mine. "From Steve." My heart dropped. Steve was our nosy next-door neighbor, the one who always seemed to know everyone's business. "What about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Jason's jaw tightened. "He said he saw you at Matthew's house, alone, more than once." The room seemed to tilt, my pulse hammering in my ears. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Jason didn't wait for an explanation. "Is it true?" he demanded, his tone sharp enough to cut through the silence. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "Yes, I've been to Matthew's house, but it's not what you think." "Then what is it?" he interrupted, his voice rising. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like my wife has been sneaking around with the neighbor while I'm at work." The accusation stung, but it wasn't entirely untrue. I couldn't deny the connection I'd felt with Matthew, the moments we'd shared that blurred the lines of friendship. But I wasn't ready to admit everything. Not yet. "We're just friends," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Jason let out a bitter laugh. "Friends? Do you think I'm stupid? Do you think I don't notice how distant you've been? How you barely even look at me anymore?" My throat tightened as tears threatened to spill. "You don't notice anything, Jason," I shot back, my voice trembling. "You've been so consumed by work, by everything else, that you don't even see me. I've felt invisible for months, maybe years. And Matthew, he noticed." Jason flinched as if I'd slapped him, but I couldn't stop the words from pouring out. "He listened to me. He cared about how I was feeling, something you stopped doing a long time ago." "So this is my fault?" Jason said, his voice laced with disbelief. "You're blaming me for your betrayal?" "I'm not saying it's right," I said, my voice breaking. "But it didn't happen in a vacuum, Jason. I've been lonely, and you weren't there." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of everything we hadn't said to each other over the years hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Jason sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. "Do you love him?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The question hit me like a freight train. Did I? What I felt for Matthew was intense, undeniable. But was it love? Or just the desperate need for connection? "I don't know," I admitted, the truth slicing through the room like a blade. Jason looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mix of anger, hurt, and something I hadn't seen in a long time. Fear. "Do you even want this marriage anymore?" The question was heavier than I could handle, and for a moment I considered lying, telling him what he wanted to hear. But I couldn't. Not anymore. "I don't know," I said again, tears streaming down my face. "I don't know what I want." Jason stood abruptly, pacing the room like a caged animal. "I can't believe this," he muttered. "I've been working my ass off to provide for us, to give us a good life, and this is how you repay me?" "Providing isn't the same as being present," I countered, my voice rising. "I never wanted all of this, Jason. I just wanted you. But you've been gone for so long, I don't even know who you are anymore." "And whose fault is that?" he snapped, his eyes narrowing. "You could have told me how you were feeling. You could have tried to fix this instead of running to someone else." "Don't you dare put this all on me," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "I tried, Jason. I tried so hard to reach you, but you were too busy to notice. And now it's too late." Jason stopped pacing, his chest heaving as he stared at me. "So what happens now?" he asked, his voice low and defeated. "I don't know," I said, the weight of my words settling heavily in the room. "I need time to figure out what I want, what we want." Jason nodded slowly, his expression hardening. "Take all the time you need," he said, his voice cold. "But don't expect me to wait around forever." He grabbed his keys and stormed out of the house, leaving me standing in the middle of the living room, my heart shattered into a million pieces. The days that followed were a blur. Jason stayed at a hotel, his absence creating a silence that was deafening. I wanted to call him, to tell him I was sorry, but I didn't know how to fix what we'd broken. Matthew reached out, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. I couldn't drag him deeper into the mess my life had become. For the first time in years, I was truly alone, and it was terrifying. The first week after Jason left was eerily quiet. I thought his absence would feel like a relief, a chance to breathe and sort through my emotions. but instead it left a void that echoed through the house. Every room felt colder, every moment of silence heavier. I spent most of my days sitting on the couch, staring at the empty coffee table or the faint indentation on the cushions where he used to sit. I didn't know what to do or where to begin. The life I had built for 10 years was crumbling, and for the first time, I had to confront the part I had played in its collapse. Jason didn't reach out, and neither did I. It felt like we were locked in a silent standoff, each waiting for the other to make the first move. Matthew texted once, just a simple, "I'm here if you need me," but I couldn't bring myself to reply. My emotions were a tangled mess, and involving him further would only complicate things. One afternoon, while folding laundry in the bedroom, I came across a forgotten photo tucked in the back of a drawer. It was from the early days of our marriage, taken on a spontaneous weekend trip to the beach. Jason was smiling, his arm around my shoulders as we stood in front of the waves. I barely recognized the carefree expression on his face, or mine. I sank onto the bed, clutching the photo as tears streamed down my face. When had we lost that version of ourselves? Was it gradual, a slow erosion of love and connection, or did it disappear in one devastating moment I hadn't noticed, and could we ever find it again? The next morning I made a decision. I couldn't let the silence stretch on indefinitely. Whether we had a future together or not, Jason and I owed it to ourselves to have honest conversation. I texted him, asking if we could talk. His response was brief but to the point. I spent the day preparing cooking his favorite meal, setting the table like I used to when we first got married. It felt strange, almost performative, but I needed everything to feel as normal as possible. By the time the clock struck 7, my stomach was in knots. When Jason walked through the door, he looked exhausted. His tie was loose and there were dark circles under his eyes, but he still managed a polite nod in my direction. "Thanks for agreeing to this," I said, gesturing for him to sit. He didn't reply, instead focusing on the plate of food in front of him. We ate in near silence, the tension so thick it was hard to breathe. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Jason," I said softly, setting my fork down, "we need to talk. Really talk." He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "So, talk." I hesitated, searching for the right words. "I'm sorry for how things have been, for what I did. It wasn't fair to you, and it wasn't fair to us. But I've felt so alone, Jason, for so long." Jason didn't look at me, his eyes fixed on the table. "Do you love him?" he asked, his voice devoid of emotion. "Don't know," I admitted, my throat tightening. What I felt, it wasn't about him, it was about what I was missing, and I didn't know how else to fill that void. He finally looked up, his eyes full of pain. "And you think I didn't feel the same way? Do you think I was happy coming home to silence, to a wife who barely looked at me?" I blinked, stunned by his admission. "You've been unhappy too?" "Of course I've been unhappy," he said, his voice rising. "But I thought we were just in a rough patch, that we'd find our way back to each other. I didn't think you'd turn to someone else." "I didn't plan for it to happen," I said, my voice breaking. "But I didn't know how to reach you anymore. Every time I tried, you were too busy or too distracted to notice." Jason rubbed his temples, letting out a long breath. "I thought I was doing everything right. I thought providing for you, for us, was enough." "It's not about the money, Jason. It never was. I just wanted you. Your time, your attention, your love. That's all I ever needed." He was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "So where do we go from here?" We spent hours talking, the kind of conversation we should have had years ago. For the first time, we were honest about our fears, our frustrations, and our failures. It wasn't easy. There were tears, accusations, and long stretches of silence where neither of us knew what to say. But it was necessary. By the end of the night, we had come to an understanding. We both wanted to try to see if there was anything left to salvage, but it wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick. "I need time," Jason said as he prepared to leave. "Time to figure out if I can forgive you, if we can move past this." "I understand," I said, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. "I need time too." He nodded, lingering for a moment before finally walking out the door. I watched him go, unsure if he'd ever come back. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into self-reflection. I started seeing a therapist, someone who helped me unpack the emotions and unmet needs that had driven me to Matthew. I learned to take responsibility for my choices while also acknowledging the deeper issues in my marriage. Jason and I spoke occasionally, mostly logistical conversations about bills and the house. He was distant but not entirely closed off, and I clung to that small glimmer of hope. As for Matthew, I avoided him completely. I couldn't face him, not until I knew where my heart truly lay. He sent a few more texts, but when I didn't respond, he stopped. I missed him, but I knew it was for the best. One evening, months later, Jason showed up unannounced. He looked different, lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. "Can we talk?" he asked, his tone softer than I'd heard in years. I nodded, inviting him in. We sat on the couch, the same spot where so many arguments had started, but this time felt different. "I've been thinking a lot," he began, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, "about us, about everything that's happened." "And?" I prompted, my heart pounding. "I'm not ready to give up," he said, meeting my gaze. "But I need to know you're willing to fight for this too. For us." Tears welled in my eyes as I nodded. "I am. I want to fix this, Jason. I really do." He reached out, taking my hand in his. "Then let's start over. Not as the people we used to be, but as who we are now. Flawed, broken, but still trying." It wasn't a grand declaration of love or a fairy tale ending, but it was real, and for the first time in a long time I felt a flicker of hope. The weeks following Jason's decision to try again were a tentative dance of rediscovery. We were two people cautiously navigating the wreckage of our past, trying to piece together a foundation for a future. There were good days where laughter crept back into the house and we shared meals without the weight of unspoken words. But there were also bad days, when old wounds bled anew and the scars of betrayal felt too raw to ignore. We started going to couples therapy. Sitting across from each other in that small, beige room felt awkward at first, like we were strangers pretending to be married, but over time the space became a haven for honesty. Jason admitted how his obsession with work had been a way to avoid facing the stagnation he'd felt in our relationship. I confessed that my loneliness had grown into resentment long before Matthew came into the picture. Slowly, we began to understand each other in ways we hadn't for years. One evening, after a particularly emotional therapy session, Jason suggested we go for a walk. The air was crisp, the kind of autumn chill that nips at your skin but feels refreshing at the same time. As we strolled through the neighborhood, I couldn't help but glance at Matthew's house as we passed. The porch light was off, the curtains drawn, but just seeing it brought a pang of guilt and longing I couldn't shake. Jason must have noticed my lingering gaze because he stopped mid-step. "Do you still think about him?" he asked, his tone steady but heavy with meaning. I hesitated, unsure how to answer without undoing all the progress we'd made. "Sometimes," I admitted finally, "but it's not what you think. It's not about him. It's about what I was looking for when I turned to." Jason nodded slowly, processing my words. "And do you think you found it? With me?" His question hung in the air, fragile and full of hope. I reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "I think we're getting there," I said, "but it's going to take time." He smiled faintly, and we continued our walk in silence, the tension easing slightly. As the weeks turned into months, Jason made a noticeable effort to be more present. He left work earlier, surprising me with small gestures that reminded me of the man I'd fallen in love with. One night, he brought home my favorite takeout and suggested we watch a movie together, something we hadn't done in years. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. I found myself doing the same, putting in effort where I hadn't before. I stopped assuming he didn't care and started sharing more of my thoughts, my day, my feelings. It wasn't easy. Vulnerability never is. But each time he responded with genuine interest or affection, it felt like we were slowly rebuilding the trust that had been shattered. One evening, while tidying the house, I stumbled across the bouquet of wildflowers Matthew had given me months ago. The petals were dry and brittle now, their vibrant colors faded. I held them for a moment, memories of that day flooding back. For a brief time, those flowers had felt like a lifeline, a reminder that I wasn't invisible. But now they felt like a chapter I was ready to close. I walked out to the garden and knelt by the rose bushes I'd spent years tending. Carefully, I buried the dried bouquet beneath the soil, letting the earth swallow the remnants of a story that no longer served me. As I stood, brushing the dirt from my hands, I felt a strange sense of relief. It was time to let go. Jason noticed the change in me, and one night, as we lay in bed, he whispered, "I think we're finally on the same team again." I turned to him, tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. "I think so too." We still had a long way to go, but for the first time, the future felt like something we could face together rather than apart. But life, as it often does, had one more twist in store. A few weeks later, I bumped into Matthew at the grocery store. It was the first time I'd seen him since everything had come to light, and my heart raced as I approached him near the produce aisle. He looked surprised to see me, but quickly masked it with a polite smile. "Hi," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "It's been a while." "It has," he replied, his tone cautious. We stood there for a moment, the weight of everything unspoken between us pressing down like a heavy fog. Finally, I broke the silence. "I just wanted to say thank you," I said, my voice soft but firm, "for everything. You were there for me when I needed someone, and I'll always be grateful for that. But I think it's time we both moved on." Matthew nodded, his expression unreadable. "I understand. I hope you find what you're looking for." "I think I'm starting to," I said with a small smile. "Take care, Matthew." "You too," he said, and with that we parted ways. It felt like the closure I didn't realize I needed, a final thread snipped from a tangled web. As I drove home, the weight I'd been carrying for months began to lift. For the first time, I felt truly free. Free to focus on the life Jason and I were trying to rebuild, free to forgive myself for my mistakes, and free to believe that healing was possible. When I walked through the door, Jason was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup. He turned to me, his face lighting up with a smile that felt genuine and warm. "How was the store?" he asked. "Good," I replied, leaning against the counter. "And you won't believe it, they had your favorite bread in stock." "Lucky me," he said, pulling me into a hug. His arms felt strong and steady, a reminder that sometimes even the most fractured relationships can find their way back to solid ground. As I rested my head against his chest, I realized that while our marriage might never be the same, it could still be something worth fighting for. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. It's been a year since that chapter of my life closed. Sometimes, when I look back, it feels like a blur of series of mistakes, heartbreaks, and moments of raw honesty that reshaped everything I thought I knew about love and marriage. Jason and I are still together, but our relationship isn't the same, and that's a good thing. We've built something new, something more honest and grounded than the surface level connection we had before. We don't take each other for granted anymore. Every small gesture, a shared laugh over morning coffee, a spontaneous date night, feels. That doesn't mean it's been easy. Trust is fragile, and rebuilding it has taken patience and forgiveness, both of ourselves and each other. There are still moments when doubt creeps in, when the memory of what happened rears its ugly head, but instead of letting it fester, we confront it. We talk. As for Matthew, I haven't seen him since that day in the grocery store. I heard through the grapevine that he moved away, looking for a fresh start in another town. I hope he's found the peace he deserves. I'll always be grateful for the role he played in my life, even if it came at a cost. He showed me what it felt like to be seen, and for that, I'll always wish him well. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd made different choices, if I'd walked away from my marriage instead of trying to fix it. But then I see Jason across the room, his face lighting up as he tells me about his day, and I know we made the right choice for us. Still, I've learned that happiness isn't something another person can give you, it's something you have to find within yourself. For years, I let my happiness hinge on others, on Jason's attention, on Matthew's kindness, but now I know better. I've rediscovered the parts of myself I thought I'd lost, my passions, my independence, my voice, and it feels good. Life isn't perfect, and it never will be, but it's real. And for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. To anyone out there struggling in their relationships, I'd say this: don't wait until it's too late to have the hard conversations. Don't assume your partner knows what you're feeling. And most importantly, don't lose yourself trying to fix something or someone else. You deserve to be whole, with or without anyone else by your side. This is my story. It's messy, complicated, and imperfect, just like life. But it's mine, and I wouldn't trade the lessons I've learned for anything.